This is Jonathan Yates. Welcome to the Culture of Sports. Returning from South Korea from the Olympic Games is Dr. Caroline Silby, who's going to discuss the culture of sports with us today. She's an acclaimed sports psychologist and the author of the book Games Girls Play and Sports Illness. Dr. Silby, welcome back.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Great to be here.
Oh, glad you could make it back, that is for sure. Now, like I think all Americans, we thank you for the great work you did with the curling team in bringing home the gold medal to the United States.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, that wasn't me. But they do have a great sports psychologist that works with them. And what you saw over at the Olympic Games, or what we saw, is there's a whole team of sports psychologists that work with the various sports. So I was over there as part of Team USA for the U.S. figure skating. And then the U.S. Olympic Committee has a number of sports psychologists that they have on staff at their different training sites, and they cover various sports. And then some of the national governing bodies also have independent consultants, like U.S. Figure Skating has me on staff. And we just are there to make sure that all the athletes throughout their careers, at least at the elite level, the Team USA athletes have the services that they need to kind of match performance with their capabilities.
Now, could you have filled in for a pinch and helped with the other teams if need be?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, every sport certainly has its own kind of specific dynamics, but certainly there's a set of similarities in terms of approach and kind of issues that we see athletes across all sports confront, specifically at an Olympic Games. So when you get to that elite level, it's kind of interesting. At the elite level, the research shows that it's really only a 3% difference in performance between the athlete that wins the gold medal and the athlete that doesn't make the team. So you're talking about very small differentiator in terms of performance. So, the good news I always say about that statistic and that data is that very small actions taken consistently can make a big difference in terms of performance. So yes, I think I could have filled in for curling. Whether I could have done as good of a job as Carly, I don't know. She certainly did an outstanding, stellar job with their team.
Now, I read a good article in the Wall Street Journal about how the Norwegian team, which dominated the Winter Olympics, used humor in their training throughout the things. What was that like to watch? Yeah,
it was. It's always interesting to kind of learn about the different strategies that resonate with individual athletes or a team of athletes. And I think everybody, part of sports psychology is a lot of people can teach kind of the foundation and the strategies that are used in sports psychology, and you can read about them in a textbook. But being able to kind of tap into what resonates with an individual athlete and what helps that athlete engage their own greatness, and if they're on a team sport, kind of engage the greatness of others around them, becomes kind of the art of the business.
Now, I read a great book. It was called Beartown by Frederick Bachman. It was not nearly as good as either one of your books, to be sure. But it was about a hockey team in a small mill town in Sweden. And the old retiring coach said to the new coach, he said, great athletes, they're like a thoroughbred. They do what they do for, that's what they do. Yeah. He said the job for a coach is to get that great athlete to do it for the team. How do you do that as a sports psychologist? You've always dealt with elite level athletes.
Yeah, and I do a lot of work in individual sports, and what was interesting, and then I'll talk to you about the team sport piece, but what was interesting at the Olympic Games was all of a sudden you take a bunch of individuals who are competing for themselves and then you put them on a team and send them to an Olympic Games or a World Championships. And it was really actually fascinating to watch them all kind of figure that transformation out in terms of how they could support one another when they're going from all competing for the same spot to get onto the team, to then having to really kind of support one another. And it was interesting that once you put that challenge in front of them, they can start to step up to the plate in doing that. One of the things that we start early with, especially high school athletes on teams, is really talking about that to be a great athlete on a team sport, you have to not only know how to engage your own individual greatness and align your performance with your capabilities consistently, but you have to know how and be willing to engage the greatness of those around you. And a lot of that comes from the way in which you talk and communicate with your teammates. And it's also showing that kind of leadership, figuring out how to tap into the leadership that's going to be helpful to everybody on the team.
And so how do you do that? I know from personal experience, my uncle pitched for the Cincinnati Reds. An elite athlete is cutthroat. You know, it's basically I win, you lose. It's a zero-sum game.
Right.
So how do you get them to play as a team?
Well, part of it is starting with that perspective shift, you know, that it isn't all about me, because I have to give up control and I have to be able to be reliant on these other people for us to elevate and to really get where we want to be. So I think it all starts really with buying into the mission of the team. And so we spend a lot of time with teams defining, just like you would in a business, defining what is your mission. And how do we then take individual resources? So you then kind of, once the mission is defined, you've got to figure out, okay, everybody on the team has to know what their signature strengths are. What do I bring to this team? How do I elevate my own game? And you can identify those factors, and everyone has to understand how they control and contribute to their own performance success, as you said, individually. Mm-hmm. But then the next thing is then the communication has to start, okay, and how do we engage the greatness of other people on the team? But once people understand how you tap into that, it can make a big difference. So for instance, there's certain players on a team that if you yell at them and you hold them accountable, they step it up. There are other people on the team, when you do that, they're crushed and their confidence is chipped away at. So knowing kind of how to interact and how to respond to the various people within the team and how that taps into those people's confidence and how they can use that to elevate their game becomes really important.
Now there's the legendary story where Phil Jackson, the coach of the Bulls, said to Michael Jordan, you can score 40 points a game and we're going to get knocked out of the first round of the playoff. You score 25 and elevate your teammates and we'll win championships.
Right.
How do you impress that upon the athletes?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's what I just said, that it's got to come not just from me as the outside consultant, but it's got to become the culture of the team. So on a very regular basis, I mean, I think coaches set the standard for that. Mm-hmm. I also think that the players that are the leaders on the team, especially the upperclassmen, start it, you know, and start as the freshmen athletes come in, if we're talking about a collegiate team, you know, and they impress that upon the younger athletes. But it does really have to be talked about over and over again. It's not like a one-time thing where I'd come in and do a workshop on it and then nobody talks about it ever again for the rest of the season. So I also sometimes do something with teams. I don't know, you know, you're familiar, I don't know if the audience, how familiar they are with Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yes.
But it's a very, you know, basic concept in psychology. And so we kind of take that and say, okay, let's break that down for sport. What does your pyramid look like? Which would be kind of high performance at the very top, and kind of what are the secondary needs, and then what are the basic needs. And the team then defines, well, what do we absolutely have to bring to the table, you know, as just basic needs of this team. And then for kind of secondary level, to kind of get performance consistently where we want it to be, what are those second tier needs? And then last is kind of peak performance. What do we need at the top? And so, you know, examples of things people will put, you know, bringing a certain intensity level every day to practice can be a basic need. And then on a secondary level, people might say inclusion. Like I've had that one be in the secondary. Everyone feels like they need to have a role on the team and a place and a purpose. And then accountability is actually often at the top of the pyramid. For peak performance, people feel as though everyone on the team needs to be accountable to executing on the game plan. So there's a lot of different strategies that you can use to kind of create this idea of mission, you know, commitment to the mission, engaging your own personal greatness, and then engaging the greatness of others around you. But I think it's not a one-time conversation. It has to be consistent and coherent throughout the organization.
Now, I taught at the University of Iowa last semester. I taught the politics of sports, and big-time college programs are embracing sports psychology and mental health counseling more and more. As an example, Temple University just hired a full-time mental health professional on their staff. You're sort of an OG in sports psychology. How did you get your start?
Well, my interest in sports psychology really came about from my own background as an athlete. I was on the national team as a figure skater, and I guess you could say my career culminated when I competed in the Olympic trials. And since nobody in your audience has ever heard of me before, they can all guess how that turned out, and I did not make the Olympic team. But that kind of failure to make the team actually set the stage for what I wanted to do next, because when I stopped skating, and I had been one of those kids, I moved away from home at 11 to train, and there was a lot of pressure and intensity kind of with the whole thing, and I kind of sat back and said, okay, well, what was that all about? And so for me, being able to kind of say, oh, wait a second, I can really use what I learned in that sport experience and try to contribute and add value to other people's experiences. And for me, my goal really with my work is always, to help athletes grow as people through their sport experience, and really always keeping that in mind as a primary objective. But we're also trying to get performance aligned with capability consistently. So we're trying to do both of those things, but healthy, productive, engaged, empowered people first, and then, performance aligned with capability second.
Now, your father was a neurologist who was active with the Olympic teams. How much did he buy into your career as a sports psychologist?
He loves it. My dad was a neurologist. He was a team doctor. He was one of the team physicians for the 1988 Olympic team. So he was pretty psyched and happy to see me go to be able to be with the team this time around. So it's been a fun journey for the family as well.
It was interesting watching one of your interviews where you said you talked to a skater after they had a terrific performance, and they say, how did you know you did that?
Yeah.
And they say, I don't. I just did that. How do you work within the zone like that?
So it's interesting. What you're talking about is when an athlete will sit down and come to meet with me, one of the first questions I always ask is, tell me about a time you performed great or you played kind of out of your mind. And athletes have all had that experience where everything just goes right. And so they'll tell you in very, very clear terms. They'll vividly describe kind of the experience of playing great. Sometimes it's multiple times. And then that next question I ask is, okay, so now I want you to identify one action you took that you think helped contribute to that positive outcome. And 9 times out of 10, their answer is, I have no idea. So when you think about it, it's interesting because if athletes can't identify one action they take to produce positive result, it becomes very difficult to ask them to perform consistently well at that high level. So we have to actually get them to process and debrief performance when it's been very good and start to think about, what was I thinking about, and what was my perspective, and what was my pregame routine, and how was I interacting with my teammates, and all of the things that they control about performance. They can start to kind of create a formula, so to speak, so that when performance is not as good, they'll also notice very quickly and very clearly that those things that sometimes are even their natural approach to performing aren't present. In fact, when people struggle, they tend to do the exact opposite of what they do when they play very, very well. So they'll very often tell you when they're playing great that their mind is actually pretty quiet. They're very kind of connected to the action on the field and kind of what they're seeing and their instinct for the game. And when they start to not play as well, they'll describe like there's almost this disconnect that happens. So their body's out there playing, but their mind is kind of going, okay, well, what are you going to do? You're going to screw this up? You're going to get pulled out of the game? You're going to make a mistake? You're going to lose playing time? And so we have to be able to help them find strategies to reconnect.
Now, this clicked for you at an early age. In one of your previous interviews, you said what led you to look into sports psychology was you noticed a difference between what you were doing in practice and what you were doing when you were competing.
Yeah, I had differences. I could have a really great performance and then 2 weeks later be completely like wiping up the ice like the Zamboni. It was ridiculous. So it became pretty evident to everybody that what was going on in training and in practice was not translating to competitive moments. I was just so happy that there was a field out there and a solution, and that there were strategies, and that you could actually train a perspective You could train the way you thought about things. You could learn how to focus on controllable factors rather than these unknowns. I learned all about nervousness and what that meant. I always thought that, for sure I was in some dangerous and fearful situation that I had to protect myself from.
In Janesville, Wisconsin.
Yes, yes, the city of parks.
So what would the sports psychologist, Dr. Caroline Silby, do differently telling the young Caroline Silby to improve?
Well, it was interesting because when I was in graduate school, there was the head of our program at that time, a sports psychologist named Bob Rotella, who's the big golf guru. He's written a number of books on golf. He's very well known in the golf world, actually in all of sports psychology world. He's fantastic. But he used to talk about, and I remember sitting down in the first class, like the first day of graduate school, and he had this concept about trusting your training. And I thought, wow, I had never heard of that. The idea that you would actually quiet your mind down and trust what you had trained. I never knew that. Nobody ever told me that.
Well, I saw that in one of your interviews where you said the biggest mistakes are made when you go off strategy.
Yes.
But then what about what Michael Tyson said when he said that everybody's got a plan until you hit him in the mouth?
Right.
What happens when...
Well, and actually, there is a serious point to that, and it's something that I just learned being at the Olympics, is that there is data that when they kind of surveyed Olympic coaches and they said, what's your one regret, that Olympic coaches said that going off plan, not sticking to the game plan. But what I also saw at the Olympic Games is that, athletes are realizing dreams. I mean, this is this moment that in a lot of ways, those moments change your outlook and might change your perspective, even not necessarily for a lifetime, but at least in that moment in time. And so everybody, as the support team of those athletes, we all have to be able to adjust. And yes, fundamentally, you want to follow the game plan, but when the athlete shifts, you have to shift too, yes. Right? Because you have to be aligned with them and be aware and be able to see with clarity, okay.
How easy is it to do that shift in mid-course?
It's not easy, and that's what I really saw. It's not always easy.
There's not an app for that?
No.
Not yet.
Not yet. That would be a good one, yeah. Because you have to be able to have that clarity to see, okay, this is what's happening right now in this moment. And you have to be there to point that out to the athlete, most importantly, because they're not necessarily seeing it. So yes, you have to stay on point and on plan, but as the athlete shifts, you've got to be open and prepared for that. And we do try before athletes go to high-level events, and really at all levels. I mean, even at the low-level athletes that I work with, 12-year-old kids, at the lower levels, we do contingency planning. So we're looking ahead and saying, okay, what might be a distractor? What might worry you? What might get in your way of performance? Okay, let's think about what kind of responses you want to have to that. And it does reduce anxiety when you contingency plan. We all know that.
Now, I was watching Ken Dickinson on a TED Talk, and he said that when you visualize in sports, it engages the same parts of the brain as the actual activity. Have you found that to be true in your training?
Yes. So if anybody in the audience has ever visualized, sometimes when you get a very, very clear picture, you have to try to engage all of your senses. So when the picture in your mind becomes very vivid, you may even have little twitches in your fingers or your toes occur. And those are the kind of neural pathways being activated in terms of the imagery and picturing yourself doing what you want to be doing when you get out there. Now, a lot of people, when they do imagery, it's kind of interesting. We've been doing a lot of imagery lately with people when their heart rates are actually raised. And intuitively, there's not a lot of research to support it, but intuitively it makes sense, because when people are playing, their heart rates are raised. When they're nervous, their heart rates go up. So it makes sense to do some visualization or video review, even if they're watching video, when they're on the bike or when their heart rate is raised.
Now, Tom Brady, in his Time versus Tom thing for Facebook media, He said he watches films every day to visualize. Do you push that with your clients?
It depends. I wouldn't say I push it. I would say sometimes I encourage it, depending. I invite them to perhaps think about doing some imagery or visualization. It depends on the athlete, because if they're not a particularly visual person, it will take them longer. It's a skill, and it takes time to learn. What I do like to check out is if athletes are using visualization or imagery or mental rehearsal, when are they using it? How often are they using it? So, for instance, in figure skating, you have a lot of athletes who do mental rehearsal and imagery, but they don't do it on a regular basis, but they'll do it, maybe 30 minutes to an hour before they perform. And then because they haven't been doing it on a regular basis,
it doesn't help.
No, or they just see themselves mess up over and over again because they're not pairing it maybe with a relaxation exercise. But what we are recommending pretty much all of the time to most athletes now is some form of mindfulness training to learn how to manage your thoughts and allow your thoughts to be there in a very non-judgmental way, because during high-pressure events, there is so much noise in a person's head very often. So mindfulness really helps teach how to filter through a lot of those thoughts. And be responsive to be not responsive, but open to what's occurring in the moment in a really non-judgmental way. And there are some great apps. I mean, we use Headspace and Calm, and, and those are great even for kids. You can even recommend those for younger athletes. 5 to 10 minute meditations, because high achieving people have a hard time meditating for more than that.
Now, Tom Brady, he was 40 years old this year and had a Super Bowl season. Do you see that as a new area in sports psychology, showing people that age is no longer a barrier?
Yeah, that's actually a really, really interesting question to ponder. I haven't done a lot of work in that area, although certainly anybody who shows that type of resilience physically and mentally, we always want to use as role models and examples to people, and especially to young people. So I do see kind of a trend of athletes peaking at later ages, and that's across a lot of sports. So it's interesting to look at and to kind of follow the research in those areas. We've always known that when emotional maturity collides with physical capability, really good things happen, So when that, a lot of times we see emotional maturity happen at a time when physical capability is already declining. So to be able to get those to line up, and if there's a way to try to do that, it's an interesting area of work, I would think.
Now, I read an interview with Lance Armstrong when they were asking him why he did this competitive cycling over such distances. And he said, I don't do it for the pleasure, I do it for the pain.
Pain, yeah.
Have you seen that in your clients?
Yes. So when you're working with anybody who does distance sports, cross-country skiing, cycling, long distance and swimming or running, one of the interesting perspectives is that those athletes will often tell you when the pain comes, they welcome it because they're supposed to be in pain. That's what their sport is. They're pushing their physical limitations, and so they actually welcome it. And so that's a great description for athletes in sports that maybe aren't endurance related, and they say, oh, they're trying to avoid feeling tired. Ooh, I don't want to get tired. Swimmers will sometimes not go out fast enough on the front end of the race because they don't want to blow up and die at the end of the race. So it's an interesting perspective to share with them that when you really look at the top athletes, they're welcoming it and saying, no, I'm going to be tired. I know I'm going to be tired because if I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be.
Well, for a swimmer, you have drowning as an occupational hazard.
True.
Now, it's interesting when you mention physical limitations. Andrew Hutchinson, a physicist, he has a book out called Endurance, and it shows it's basically completely rotated what used to be thinking. He said that when muscles are tired now, they're not the ones that say their limitations are. They're signaling the brain that it's tired, but the brain is in charge of saying that what a muscle can do. Is he pointed out that endurance runners, those at 200 miles who have done 200 miles, they still have muscle strength left that they did not have at 100 miles. Do you find that difficult to compete someone that basically, as they say at the Naval Academy, get used to pain?
Yes, well, but it does, part of what he's saying is that it does become perspective, does kind of impact performance. And we know that the way you label a situation absolutely, your outlook on it absolutely affects pain. There are studies, for instance, that say when people curse, they can endure pain a little bit longer. So there are certainly strategies out there that help people to kind of push the limits, but figuring out kind of what strategy is going to work in the moment. Very often we'll have people, actually there's a really great video of a guy named Billy Mills, and they consider it the greatest upset in Olympic history. He was a track and field athlete in the 64 Olympics, maybe in the 60s. And he ended up winning this race. And one of the things that was interesting was that he had to drop like 2 minutes off his time, which was, an unheard of amount
for the Olympics,
of time at the elite level. And he said, I had to find a way to think about that allowed me to take some kind of action on it. And he said, I just realized I have to stay on the intensity of my pace that much. And so that enabled him to do it, and to kind of find a way to shift perspective so that he could then get where he needed to be.
And do you find more athletes interested in sort of the spiritual side of sports now?
Yes.
Aristotle, he said that we're closest to pure contemplation, which is the highest level of activity for humans when we're playing sports. And when you look at the Buddhist concept of detachment, that's removing you from all earthly pleasures, such as lust, greed, and craving, which is the definition of pain. Do you have more athletes approaching you from that way now?
Yes. The whole idea of, I think athletes are, especially at the higher levels, are recognizing that they're not by nature just going to shut their minds off in those moments, that when you get into these critical moments, and like in Olympic Games, you've worked your whole life to be there and this is your moment, it's not natural for your mind to just shut off. And so that is something that you have to find ways that resonate for you to be able to kind of have that quiet mind, to be open to the experience, to be able to see what's in front of you with clarity and to respond to your instincts and your training. And so for some people, that may be their spiritual beliefs. For other, it may be meditation. But I think every athlete has to find what works for them. And I'm certainly open to helping athletes explore those places that fit correctly with their beliefs and their lifestyle and what works for them.
So you've always been ahead of the curve in sports psychology. What do you see as the future for it? Yes. You got into it long before.
Yeah, I think sports psychology and counseling and psychology in general is really going to be have much more synergy with neurology and the kind of the neuropsych end of the continuum. Neuroscience is just playing such a big role in us understanding the brain and how the brain works and the brain's connection to the rest of the body. And so our self-talk and our perceptions and all of these aspects, our breathing, our ability to quiet our minds. I think just the neuroscience behind that is so interesting and so useful in terms of us on the application side to really understanding what's going to work for these athletes.
Now, in a recent game when Loyola beat Tennessee in the NCAA, Sister Louise Schmidt, the chaplain for the team, she told them, don't worry about Tennessee being taller. You guys rebound well, you play well, you jump well, keep it in mind.
Yes, love it. Well, yeah, I call that the truth. I do something called the ring of truths with athletes. Sure. So whenever you're going up against somebody, specifically when you're going up against other great athletes, yes. The mind tilts towards the unknown. Well, what's going to happen? And so you always want to help athletes focus on what they know, the knowns, and those are truths about their game, right? And so to be able to put those in front of them is a very powerful kind of
Particularly when it's coming from a 98-year-old
strategy.
nun.
Well, exactly. And the fact that she knew that about them, I'm sure just pleased them to no end, you know.
Dr. Silby, I visualized a great interview, and it's definitely come through.
Thank
This
you
is
so
Jonathan
much.
Yates. Thank you for joining us in the Culture of Sports.